Women shall not lie with a woman as one lies with a man. It is an abomination if there is a woman who lies with a woman as those who lie with a man. Both of them have committed a detestable act.
Wait, where are all the people on the stages? What is this? What's this place we're at, Mom?
It's just a pit stop, honey. Don't be mad at Mommy. You're just in a facility where you can recognize God's love.
No!
Mother Sarah will be in to brief you on what will happen the remainder of your stay. Someone will be in with your dinner later.
I thought I wouldn't lust after girls anymore, but I haven't changed.
You can only get better from here, right?
Right.
You are a threat to natural law. You are a threat to God's will. And you are a threat to others' souls. Like Lucifer, you seduce people into thinking that your sin is natural, but it's not.
Why did you ever come here? Did you enjoy that little show?
Okay, this is ridiculous. I don't need these.
Oh, hello, Hayley. Me and Mallory were just finishing up. Come on in.
You too.
No closed doors around here, Hayley.
How many before me?
It was very dark. She couldn't have known what she was seeing.
Come with me.
Hayley, arrival at Women for Wholeness, begins with a betrayal so foundational that it deserves to be named plainly before anything else about this story can be understood, because the two people she trusted most in the world, her mother and her girlfriend, are revealed within the space of a single car ride and a single doorway to have been complicit in delivering her into captivity. And this double betrayal matters enormously for how we read everything that follows, because Hayley isn't simply a young woman being institutionalized against her will. She is a young woman discovering in real time that the architecture of trust she built her entire life around, family and romantic partnership, the two relationships most people rely on as bedrock, have both been weaponized against her. And this specific configuration of harm, being handed over by the people who are supposed to protect you, reflects one of the most devastating and unfortunately common realities many queer people have actually lived through. The discovery that coming out or being discovered can transform even a parent's love into something conditional, something that evaporates, or curdles into control the moment it encounters a truth the parent isn't willing to accept. And Kira's presence among the women running this facility, rather than beside Hayley as an ally, represents perhaps the cruelest single detail of this opening, because it suggests that even the person Hayley may have trusted enough to be vulnerable with romantically, the person who presumably knew her most intimately, either could not withstand family or social pressure to remain loyal to her, or worse, may have never actually seen Hayley's love as legitimate to begin with. And either possibility describes a wound that goes beyond ordinary heartbreak into a much deeper crisis of trust in her own judgment, her own ability to know who is safe. The facility's operating logic, built around Utah's legal provisions for involuntary commitment, someone is deemed a threat to their own safety or the safety of others, deserves careful and unflinching scrutiny because Mother Sarah's cited justification, that Hayley endangers the souls of others by believing her attraction to women is natural, represents an almost perfect distillation of how institutional power has historically been marshaled against queer people, taking language originally designed to protect vulnerable individuals from genuine danger and repurposing it to punish and control people for the mere fact of who they love. And this legal contortion, however fictionalized in this particular story, echoes real historical and ongoing practices. The pathologizing of queerness as mental illness, as spiritual corruption, as contagion, frameworks that have been used across decades and across many countries to justify exactly this kind of forced institutionalization, family betrayal, and physical control, And the story's decision to render this mechanism explicitly rather than softening it deserves recognition as an act of honesty about a real and ongoing harm, rather than melodrama for its own sake. Steph's physical violence toward Hayley, the casual, brutal act of lifting and dropping her to the floor when she objects, establishes immediately and without ambiguity that this facility operates through coercion and force rather than genuine care. And it's important to hold on to this detail throughout any analysis of what follows, because whatever connections or intimacies develop among the young women held here cannot be read as though they're occurring in a neutral or merely restrictive environment. They're occurring under active threat of violence, under surveillance, under a system explicitly designed to break down each woman's sense of self until she either genuinely believes the institution's doctrine or convincingly performs having been cured. And this context matters enormously for how we understand every interaction between the detained women from this point forward, because nothing that happens between them can be separated from the fact that they are literally being held captive for the crime of their own capacity to love. The introduction of the other young women, Christina, Victoria, Claire, and sisters Mallory and Valerie, establishes a community of shared suffering, and there is real and painful truth in imagining what it might mean for Hayley to realize, likely within her first hours or days at this facility, that she is not alone in this particular horror, that other young women have been delivered here by their own families for the same reason. And this recognition, however bleak the circumstances producing it, carries its own complicated weight. Because solidarity born of shared persecution has a long and real history within queer community, going back to eras when the only people who could truly understand a particular kind of danger or grief were others who had lived through the same danger. And Hayley's discovery of these other women likely produces an immediate, wordless recognition, the specific relief of no longer being the only one, even as that relief exists alongside the horror of what they're all actually experiencing together. Whatever quiet connection develops between any of these young women inside this facility deserves to be understood specifically as resistance rather than romance in the conventional sense. Because an institution built entirely around convincing these women that their love for other women is sinful, dangerous, in need of forceful correction, is directly threatened by any moment in which two of them find a way to see each other with tenderness rather than the shame the facility is trying to instill. And a glance held a beat too long between two young women who have both been told their capacity for connection is diseased, a hand quietly offered during a moment of fear or humiliation. These small acts, however restrained and however carefully hidden from the facility's staff, function as genuine defiance, proof surviving in real time that the institution's core claim that their love is wrong and must be extinguished has not actually succeeded in extinguishing anything. And this reframing matters enormously for how this story should be read. Because tenderness that persists specifically because it has been forbidden carries a different weight and different meaning than tenderness that develops in freedom. It becomes evidence of something the facility cannot control, no matter how much physical and psychological force it applies. The simple, stubborn fact that these women's capacity to recognize and care for each other survives even under conditions explicitly designed to destroy it. This distinction between romance as pleasant discovery and tenderness as active resistance deserves to anchor any serious analysis of what happens inside this facility. Because collapsing these two registers, treating captivity and coercion as simply an inconvenient backdrop for a love story, would badly misrepresent what's actually happening, and would risk aestheticizing an institution modeled on real ongoing harm inflicted on real queer people. Families who have genuinely sent their children to facilities built on exactly this premise. Adults who have genuinely lived through forced institutionalization for their sexuality, and any story taking this premise seriously, owes those real experiences the respect of keeping the horror of the setting fully present rather than softened into scenery, which means whatever hope or connection this story ultimately offers its characters has to be earned specifically through their resistance to the facility's control, not through the facility somehow receding into the background long enough for an uncomplicated romance to bloom. Hayley's psychological survival throughout this ordeal, her ability to hold on to some private, unbroken sense of her own truth, even as authority figures around her insist that truth is sinful and dangerous, represents the story's actual emotional stakes, because the facility's entire purpose is to convince these young women that who they are is fundamentally wrong, that their family's betrayal and their own commitment are justified responses to a genuine spiritual or psychological defect. And Hayley's task, the real path this story is actually charting, is not toward some externally defined forgiveness of the people who put her here, but toward her own internal refusal to accept their verdict about who she is. And any genuine connection she forms with the other young women held alongside her matters precisely because it reinforces this internal refusal. Because being seen and cared for by someone who understands exactly what's being done to both of them offers a form of evidence, however quiet, and however dangerous to express openly. That the facility's entire ideological project is a lie. That her capacity to love is not a sickness requiring correction, but simply, stubbornly, who she actually is. And if this story ultimately follows these young women towards some form of escape, rescue, or survival beyond these walls, the real triumph being depicted isn't a romance that managed to bloom despite terrible circumstances, but rather the harder and more significant victory of a group of young women managing to preserve their own sense of truth and worth against an institution built entirely to destroy it, carrying that preserved sense of self back out into a world that, the story reminds us through its own unflinching premise, still has not fully reckoned with its own discomfort at women loving women. Hayley. Education in survival begins not with any lesson from the facility's official curriculum, but with the quieter, more essential curriculum Victoria offers her in whispered fragments between required activities. Keep your head down, go along with the program. Don't give them a reason to look at you twice. And this kind of practical, hard-won wisdom, passed from one captive to another rather than from any figure of authority, deserves recognition as its own form of resistance. Because Victoria is teaching Hayley something the facility desperately does not want any of these young women to learn from each other: the difference between genuine transformation and convincing performance. And in offering this distinction so early in Hayley's captivity, Victoria is quietly equipping her with the tools to protect her actual inner self by allowing her outer self to become whatever shape keeps her safest. A strategy that will likely feel achingly familiar to any queer person who has ever had to perform a version of themselves for family, employer, or community specifically in order to survive a period of their life during which authenticity carried real danger. This particular kind of survival wisdom, learning to perform compliance while protecting an inner truth from ever actually being extinguished, has a long history within queer experience broadly. Closeted people across generations have developed exactly this skill, presenting whatever face was required by the room they were standing in while guarding some private, unassailable core of self-knowledge that no amount of external pressure could actually touch. And Victoria's willingness to share this hard-earned knowledge with Hayley so quickly after her arrival suggests someone who has already done the difficult work of accepting her circumstances clearly enough to strategize within them rather than simply suffering passively. And there is real, if bleak, tenderness in this act of teaching. One captive woman extending practical care to another, not through comfort or reassurance, but through the more useful gift of actionable information that might genuinely keep her safer. Hayley's decision to hide around the corner and watch as Claire enters Mother Sarah's office for her individual session represents a meaningful escalation in her own understanding of what this facility actually does behind its official language of healing and wholeness. Because up to this point, Hayley has experienced the facility's cruelty primarily through her own treatment. The forced admission, steps violence, the general atmosphere of surveillance and control. But witnessing another young woman disappear into one of these sessions forces a more expansive and more horrifying recognition that whatever is happening to her personally is also happening, individually and repeatedly, to every other young woman held here. And this recognition matters because it transforms Hayley's understanding of the facility from a personal ordeal into a systemic one, revealing the sheer scale of harm being inflicted rather than allowing her to process her own experience as an isolated incident. What unfolds behind that office door, whatever specific form it takes, needs to be understood clearly and without euphemism as abuse. An adult in a position of total institutional control exploiting a captive teenager under the pretense of spiritual correction, and there is no framing, however the facility's own language might describe it as unorthodox methods or cleansing, that changes the fundamental nature of what's actually occurring. An abuse of power over someone who cannot leave, cannot refuse, and has been systematically stripped of any external recourse or protection. And any suggestion that a victim in this position might be experiencing something other than fear, dissociation, or the specific psychological damage of learned helplessness deserves to be named plainly as a distortion that abusers and the institutions that shelter them have long relied upon. The insistence that a victim's survival responses, whatever shape they take, freezing, complying, even displaying something that might superficially resemble calm, constitute enjoyment or consent, when in fact, these responses represent nothing more than the body and mind's attempt to survive in situation with no other available options. Hayley's position as an unwilling witness to this abuse deserves careful attention because there is a specific and complicated horror in seeing harm you are powerless to stop. And this powerlessness compounds rather than diminishes the trauma of witnessing, because Hayley now carries not only the burden of her own captivity but the knowledge of what's happening to the other women around her, a knowledge she cannot act on without risking severe consequences to herself. And this particular bind, Understanding clearly that something terrible is happening while being unable to intervene without endangering yourself further describes a real and devastating experience many people have faced in situations of institutional or systemic abuse, whether in cults, authoritarian households, or facilities exactly like this fictionalized one. The excruciating math of trying to determine whether attempting to help another victim will actually help her, or simply add another casualty to whatever is already unfolding. What Hayley does with this knowledge in the moments and days that follow matters enormously for understanding her own arc. Because witnessing this abuse likely accelerates whatever private reserve of resistance Victoria's earlier guidance was helping her build, transforming abstract awareness that the facility is harmful into direct, undeniable evidence of exactly what that harm looks like up close. And this kind of forced confrontation with reality, however traumatic in the moment, often becomes the foundation for later resolve. The specific, concrete memory that a survivor carries forward as proof that whatever justification the institution offered for its methods was always a lie, that there was never anything therapeutic or healing happening within these walls, only control dressed in the language of care. Claire's suffering, whatever form the facility inflicts upon her, deserves to be centered in this analysis as exactly that, suffering, a young woman being harmed by someone who holds total power over her circumstances. And any story taking this premise seriously has an obligation to eventually let Claire's own interiority surface clearly enough that she is never reduced to simply an object of Mother Sarah's control or Hayley's horrified witnessing, because Claire deserves, within her own narrative arc, the chance to be understood as someone actively surviving, rather than merely a demonstration of the facility's cruelty for other characters or the audience to react to. And a story genuinely interested in these young women's interior lives would need to eventually give Claire her own voice, her own account of what she's enduring and how she's managing to survive it, rather than leaving her permanently positioned as the person things happen to, while others watch. The bond quietly forming between Hayley and Victoria, built through this shared education in survival and now deepened by Hayley's traumatic witnessing of what the facility actually does to its captives, deserves to be read as exactly the kind of solidarity this analysis identified in the previous scene, connection forged specifically as resistance to an institution designed to isolate and break each woman individually. And every moment these two young women trust each other enough to share real information, real strategy, real acknowledgement of what's actually happening around them, represents a small but genuine victory against a system that depends on isolation and psychological fragmentation to maintain control. Because an institution like this one functions most effectively when each captive believes she is alone in her suffering, unable to verify whether her own perception of events is accurate, or whether the facility's official narrative of healing and progress might actually be true. And Victoria's willingness to speak plainly with Hayley, to name the reality of what's happening rather than allowing the facility's language to go unchallenged, offers Hayley something genuinely precious, a second set of eyes confirming that what she's witnessing is real, that her horror is a sane and appropriate response rather than a symptom requiring correction, and this kind of mutual verification, two people confirming to each other that the abuse they're witnessing is actually abuse and not, as the facility insists, healing, represents one of the most important survival tools available to anyone trapped inside a system built on gaslighting and control. The simple, essential act of another person saying, "Yes, I see it too, you're not imagining this." And whatever Hayley and Victoria build together from this point forward, whatever quiet resistance or eventual escape they manage to construct, will have been made possible in large part by this foundational, hard-won trust. Two young women choosing to believe each other over the institution that holds them, and finding in that mutual belief the first real foothold toward eventually getting out. Claire's emergence from Mother Sarah's office carries with it a confusion that deserves to be named honestly rather than smoothed over, because the shame she feels is entirely legitimate, born of an institution that has spent every session insisting her very identity is sinful and requires correction. While whatever conflicting sensation exists alongside that shame reflects nothing more than the body's confused physiological response to violation, a response that trauma survivors experience with unfortunate frequency, and that abusers and abusive institutions have long exploited to convince victims that their own bodies betrayed them into some kind of complicity. And it matters enormously that this conflation never be read as evidence of genuine desire, because what Claire is actually carrying out of that office is the disorientation of having been harmed by someone with total power over her, dressed in language of spiritual healing. And the specific cruelty of an institution like this one lies precisely in its capacity to make victims doubt their own clear-eyed understanding of what was done to them. Christina's presence waiting for Claire, offering encouraging words rather than pressing for details Claire isn't ready to share, models something valuable about how survivors within a shared, ongoing trauma often learn to care for one another, not through interrogation or forced processing, but through simple, steady presence, the willingness to be there without demanding immediate explanation, and this kind of patient companionship, letting someone arrive at their own capacity to speak rather than extracting the story before they're ready, reflects real emotional wisdom, the understanding that support sometimes looks like simply staying rather than fixing. The detail that every young woman in this facility appears to be performing compliance specifically in hopes of release before turning 21 deserves real attention, because it reveals the precise mechanism of control this institution relies upon. A countdown that gives each captive a reason to suppress her own resistance in service of a finite, survivable timeline. And this detail illuminates something important about how institutional abuse maintains itself, not simply through force in the moment, but through the psychological management of hope, convincing victims that endurance and performance will eventually be rewarded with freedom, which keeps them invested in outlasting, rather than actively resisting a system that might otherwise face more direct, collective defiance if its victims believed they had nothing left to lose. When Claire finally asks Christina to share her own story, the moment functions as exactly the kind of mutual disclosure that builds real trust between people who have both been harmed, and Christina's willingness to tell it honestly, without minimizing or performing the facility's preferred narrative of shame and correction, represents its own quiet act of resistance. Because every time a captive woman tells her own true story to another captive woman rather than the story the institution demands of her, she is preserving a version of reality the facility is actively trying to erase. Christina's account of falling in love with her best friend Abigail deserves to be read with real tenderness, because the specific shape of their story, a long friendship deepening slowly into something neither woman initially had language for, followed by Christina's decision to marry a man despite these unresolved feelings, reflects an experience many queer women recognize achingly well, the attempt to follow the expected script, to build the conventional life that family and community sanction, while some truer feeling remains unaddressed, quietly persisting beneath the surface of a marriage that looks, from the outside, like a complete and acceptable life. This detail, that Christina married a man while still carrying unresolved love for Abigail, should not be read as evidence of confusion or bad faith on Christina's part, but rather as a demonstration of exactly how much pressure exists to choose the legible, socially rewarded path even when it doesn't reflect a person's deepest truth. And many women, queer and otherwise, understand intimately the particular exhaustion of trying to convince yourself that a reasonable, appropriate choice should be enough to satisfy a longing that reasonable, appropriate choices were never actually designed to address. Abigail's attempts to evade Christina and the feelings between them, rather than reading as rejection, deserve to be understood as their own form of self-protection, an attempt to respect the boundary of her friend's marriage, to avoid causing harm to a life Christina had already built. And this mutual restraint, both women trying, for a time, to honor an existing commitment rather than pursue what they actually wanted, reflects the kind of careful, ethically considered hesitation that this analysis has returned to throughout this catalog. The recognition that real love sometimes requires waiting, restraining, even walking away, rather than simply seizing whatever feeling presents itself regardless of cost to others. The eventual collapse of that restraint, the tearful confession, and the choice to finally act on years of suppressed feeling deserves to be read as a moment of genuine, hard-won honesty, rather than a betrayal or a lapse, because Christina and Abigail's love had already survived years of deliberate suppression in service of Christina's marriage, which suggests this was never a fleeting or careless attraction but a persistent, deeply rooted truth that both women had tried, in good faith, to set aside. And the fact that it eventually proved impossible to permanently deny speaks to the genuine depth of what existed between them, rather than any failure of character or commitment. The devastating turn, Christina's husband discovering them and responding not with any attempt at conversation or reckoning but with institutionalization, deserves to be read as the true villainy of the story, a man choosing to weaponize legal and familial power against his wife, rather than simply accepting that their marriage had reached its natural end. And this response illuminates something crucial about the broader cultural discomfort this entire series has been examining. The fact that a wife's authentic love for another woman is treated by this husband not as a private matter of the heart he might grieve and release her from, but as something requiring forcible suppression, correction, punishment, a response that reveals far more about his own need for control than about any genuine concern for Christina's well-being. What makes Christina's story so significant within the larger narrative of The path to forgiveness is that it locates the source of harm precisely where it belongs, not in the love she shares with Abigail, which the story allows to be genuinely tender, mutual, and years in the making, but in the institutional and marital power exercised against her once that love could no longer be hidden. And Christina's yearning for freedom, then, is not a yearning to escape her own truth, but a yearning to escape the punishment inflicted on her for finally living inside it. And this distinction matters enormously for how the story frames its central question, because the facility and the husband who committed her are not protecting Christina from anything genuinely harmful. They are simply enforcing a social order that cannot tolerate her authentic self. And every act of solidarity between these captive women, Christina's willingness to share her true story with Claire, Claire's willingness to receive it without judgment, represents a small but real refusal of that enforced order, a quiet insistence that their loves, however inconvenient to the people who claim authority over them, were never the thing that needed correcting in the first place. Mother. Sarah's confrontation with Mother Lauren deserves scrutiny before anything else in this scene, because the language used to frame Lauren's abuse of her position, sin, betrayal of trust, behavior conducted behind closed doors, reveals something important about how this facility actually understands harm. And it's worth naming plainly that Sarah's objection to Lauren's conduct appears to be rooted not in genuine concern for the young women being harmed, but in a more institutional, almost proprietary anger about Lauren jeopardizing the facility's reputation and violating the sibling trust between two women who inherited this operation from their parents. And this distinction matters enormously, because an institution that treats the abuse of its captives as primarily a private betrayal between the people running it, rather than as a crime against the vulnerable people in its care, reveals itself to be concerned with self-preservation and internal power dynamics, rather than any authentic mission of protection. And Sarah's threat to remove Lauren from the camp reads less like accountability and more like two people fighting over control of a shared inheritance, while the actual victims of that inheritance's cruelty remain entirely unmentioned in the negotiation, which tells us something chilling about how thoroughly this facility has organized itself around protecting its own operation, rather than the young women supposedly being healed within it. This detail deserves to inform how we read every subsequent development in the facility's power structure, because it confirms that no meaningful internal correction is likely to come from within, that whatever justice or safety the detained women eventually find will have to come from their own resistance and escape, rather than from any genuine reckoning by the people running this institution. And this recognition sets the stakes for Hayley's storyline with real clarity, because it means the facility itself will not save these women from within, making any external route toward freedom, however uncertain or risky, the only real path forward. Hayley's encounter with Jordan while doing the mundane, almost meditative task of hanging laundry carries real emotional weight precisely because of its ordinariness. Because this kind of quiet domestic labor, repetitive and unglamorous, often becomes the setting for a captive's most honest internal reckonings, the mind wandering freely even as the hands stay occupied. And Hayley's anger upon seeing Jordan, her clear reluctance to engage, deserves to be honored as legitimate rather than something to be quickly overcome. Because whatever history exists between them has apparently left Hayley with real reason for guardedness, and a story genuinely interested in taking women's interior lives seriously needs to let that anger exist fully before allowing any reconciliation, rather than having Hayley's defenses simply evaporate at the first soulful glance. Because trust that collapses too easily after real betrayal or hurt doesn't actually reflect emotional truth. It reflects wish fulfillment. And Hayley's eventual softening toward Jordan only means something if her anger was allowed to be real and substantial first. Jordan's position as a hunter for the camp, whatever this specific role entails within the facility's operations, deserves careful, skeptical scrutiny before her account of it can be trusted. Because a role explicitly tied to capturing or returning those who attempt to escape represents genuine institutional complicity. And Hayley's willingness to hear Jordan's explanation, to actually listen to why she occupies this position rather than assuming the worst, reflects real emotional maturity. But this willingness to listen should not be confused with automatic belief, because the story's own credibility depends on making clear that Jordan's explanation actually holds up to scrutiny, that her role as a hunter reflects genuine constraint or strategic necessity, rather than simple complicity dressed up as circumstance. And any reader or viewer should want to understand precisely why someone in a position specifically designed to prevent escape would then turn around and offer Hayley an escape plan. Because if this reversal isn't grounded in something substantive, some genuine account of coercion or long-game strategy that makes sense within the facility's operations, then Hayley's trust in Jordan risks repeating exactly the kind of misplaced faith that led to her original betrayal by her mother and her girlfriend, and a story invested in Hayley's growth would want her to arrive at trust through actual evidence and reasoning rather than simply through the emotional pull of recognizing someone she loves. What makes this recognition scene genuinely moving, if the story does the work of earning it, is the specific vulnerability of choosing to trust someone again after having your trust in two of the people closest to you so completely violated. Because Hayley's willingness to even consider Jordan's plan represents real courage, not naive credulity but a deliberate, difficult choice to remain open to connection despite every reason circumstance has given her to close herself off entirely. And this capacity to risk trust again after profound betrayal deserves recognition as one of the most significant acts of resilience a person can manage, because the alternative, permanent guardedness, protects against further harm, but also forecloses the possibility of the exact kind of genuine alliance that might actually help her survive and escape. And Hayley choosing to extend trust cautiously, with her eyes open, having heard Jordan's explanation and weighed it, rather than simply melting at the sight of her, models something valuable for anyone who has had to decide, after being hurt badly, whether to remain open to people who might genuinely deserve that openness, or to protect themselves through permanent isolation. The escape plan itself, whatever specific form it eventually takes, represents the culmination of everything this story has been building toward across its first several scenes. The growing recognition among these captive women that survival requires both individual resistance and eventual collective action, and Jordan's willingness to risk her own position within the facility's structure to help Hayley get out, if her motives prove genuine, would represent a significant act of solidarity, someone embedded within the system choosing to work against it, rather than simply performing her assigned role indefinitely. And this kind of insider defection, someone who has access and knowledge specifically because of their position within an oppressive structure choosing to use that access to help those the structure is designed to harm, reflects a real and valuable pattern of resistance that exists in many contexts of institutional abuse. The recognition that meaningful escape or exposure often depends on someone with insider knowledge being willing to risk everything to help those without it. What ultimately makes this scene significant within the larger arc of the path to forgiveness is its insistence that hope, however fragile and however hard-won, remains possible even within a system explicitly designed to crush it. And Hayley's cautious willingness to trust Jordan again, paired with her growing understanding of exactly how corrupt and self-interested the facility's leadership actually is, suggests a young woman whose capacity for connection has survived everything done to damage it, who has not allowed betrayal to permanently foreclose her ability to recognize genuine care when it's offered. And this resilience, the ability to remain capable of love and trust even after profound violation, represents the story's real emotional argument. That whatever this facility and the people who sent these women here believe about the wrongness of their capacity to love, that capacity itself, stubborn and enduring even under conditions built to destroy it, remains the truest and most reliable thing about who they actually are. The whole, as Hayley experiences it, deserves to be understood not simply as a physical location, but as the facility's most concentrated weapon, a space engineered specifically to accomplish through isolation and sensory deprivation what individual sessions and daily indoctrination had not yet fully achieved: the complete collapse of a person's ability to trust her own perception of herself. And this is worth naming plainly because solitary confinement of this kind, used across many real institutional contexts, from psychiatric facilities to prisons to religious reform programs, functions precisely by removing every external voice that might contradict the institution's narrative, leaving a person alone with nothing but the accusations already planted in her mind, so that eventually those accusations begin to feel less like imposed belief and more like her own conclusion, arrived at independently. And this is the specific cruelty of isolation as a tool of psychological control. It doesn't simply punish. It attempts to make a person complicit in her own indoctrination by removing anyone who might remind her that the story being told about her is a lie. Hayley's descent into believing, even briefly, that she might actually be bad, that the facility's core claim about her capacity to love women might be correct, represents exactly the outcome this kind of isolation is designed to produce. And it would be a mistake to read this despair as any kind of genuine self-discovery or moment of doubt worth taking seriously as insight, because it is instead the entirely predictable result of psychological torture, the mind's attempt to make sense of overwhelming pain by finding some internal logic, however false, that might explain why the pain is happening. And many survivors of coercive institutions describe exactly this phenomenon, a period during extended isolation or abuse, where the abuser's narrative starts to feel true simply because there's no longer any competing voice available to argue otherwise. Victoria's appearance at the door of the hole, her hand extended without hesitation, deserves to be read as an act of profound risk and profound care simultaneously, because reaching into this specific space to retrieve someone the facility has deliberately isolated represents a direct defiance of the institution's central method of control. And the willingness to take on whatever danger this defiance carries in order to physically pull Hayley back into connection and community demonstrates exactly the kind of solidarity this analysis has traced throughout the earlier scenes of this story. The recognition that isolation is the facility's primary weapon, and that the antidote to isolation, quite simply, is another person's refusal to leave you alone in it. The bathing that follows deserves to be understood specifically as an act of restorative care rather than romance, because what Hayley needs in this precise moment is not desire but the most basic forms of human. Tending, warmth, gentleness, the physical restoration of dignity after days spent in conditions designed to strip it away, and Victoria's careful attention to her, removing the clothes that likely carry the physical residue of confinement, warming her body, washing away what the hold did to her, mirrors the kind of caretaking one person offers another after any severe trauma or injury. A nurse tending a patient, a friend caring for someone who has survived something terrible. And reading this moment correctly requires resisting any impulse to romanticize or sexualize an act of care extended towards someone in a state of such profound vulnerability and psychological injury, because Hayley, having just emerged from days of isolation specifically engineered to break her sense of self, is not in a position to be understood as a participant in romantic intimacy in this moment. She is a survivor being tended to, and Victoria's role here is fundamentally that of caretaker, someone using gentleness and physical warmth to begin the slow work of reminding Hayley's body and mind that care and safety still exist in the world, that the whole message was a lie. The moment Hayley looks into Victoria's eyes and feels something like love returning to her deserves to be read as something considerably larger and more significant than romantic attraction specifically, because what's actually being restored here is Hayley's fundamental capacity for connection itself. The recognition, after days spent being told that her capacity to love is the thing making her bad. That love, in all its forms, tenderness, friendship, care extended freely by another person, still exists and still reaches her. And this restoration matters enormously because it directly contradicts everything the whole was designed to teach her, proving through Victoria's actual presence and actual care that connection between women is not corruption or sin, but exactly the thing capable of pulling a person back from the edge of believing the worst about herself. Victoria's declaration that she is leaving that night, and that she refuses to leave without Hayley, represents the culmination of everything this friendship has been building towards since the earlier scene of shared survival wisdom on the laundry line, because Victoria is not simply offering Hayley an escape route as a practical matter. She is demonstrating, through the highest possible stakes, exactly how much Hayley's survival and freedom have come to matter to her, risking her own chance at escape by insisting they leave together rather than separately. And this insistence deserves to be read as the story's clearest statement yet about what real solidarity between women actually requires. Sometimes the willingness to slow down your own path to safety in order to ensure someone else isn't left behind. A choice that carries genuine risk and genuine cost. And Victoria's willingness to accept that cost speaks to the depth of what has grown between these two women through their shared suffering and shared resistance. What makes this scene significant within the broader arc of the path to forgiveness is its insistence that recovery from this kind of institutional trauma doesn't happen through willpower alone, isolated and unsupported, but through exactly this kind of embodied patient care offered by someone who has decided that Hayley's survival matters enough to risk her own safety for it, and Hayley's restoration in this moment, however partial and however much healing likely still remains ahead of her, happens specifically because Victoria refuses to let her remain alone with the whole's lies, choosing instead to physically and emotionally pull her back toward the truth that connection, care, and love between women were never the sickness this facility claimed them to be. They are, in fact, exactly what makes survival and eventual escape possible at all. The path to forgiveness, taken as a complete story rather than a sequence of individual scenes, reveals itself to be organized around a single, devastating irony embedded in its own title. Because the forgiveness this story is actually concerned with was never something these young women needed to seek. It is forgiveness they deserve to receive. From their families, from the institutions meant to protect them, from a culture that decided their capacity to love other women constituted a sin requiring correction rather than simply a fact of who they are. And the true path charted across these 5 scenes is not a path toward earning absolution for something that was never wrong, but a path toward each woman reclaiming her own certainty that she never needed forgiving in the first place. A distinction that matters enormously for understanding everything Women for Wholeness represents, and everything it ultimately fails to accomplish despite its considerable power to harm. It's worth addressing, Directly and with real care, the story's use of religious language and imagery, because the facility's methods, its citation of God's love, its language of cleansing and correction, its invocation of spiritual authority to justify forced institutionalization and abuse, represent a genuine and painful distortion of faith rather than an indictment of Christian belief itself. And this distinction deserves to be honored specifically because so many people, including many queer people, hold sincere, life-sustaining faith in Christ, find real community and comfort in Christian practice, and have reconciled their sexuality with their spiritual life through churches and communities that reject exactly the kind of coercive cruelty this facility represents. And the story's antagonists are not indicting Christianity when they weaponize religious language toward abusive ends. They are demonstrating something that has unfortunately occurred across many religious traditions throughout history. Individuals and institutions using the language of the sacred to justify entirely secular impulses toward control, power, and the suppression of anyone who threatens an existing social order. And there is a real and important difference between faith itself, which for countless people has been a source of genuine love, humility, and grace, and the specific human beings within this story who invoke that faith's vocabulary while acting in ways that reflect none of its actual values: cruelty, coercion, betrayal of trust. None of these reflect the teachings most central to Christ's own example of compassion toward the marginalized. And the story's most damning critique is not of religion, but of the particular human tendency to co-opt sacred language in service of very earthly desires for power and control. The specific gendered architecture of this facility deserves careful, unflinching examination, because it is worth noticing precisely who ends up institutionalized within these walls, and who does the institutionalizing, and the pattern that emerges is a familiar and troubling one. Women, specifically young women, whose love for other women threatens an existing patriarchal and heteronormative order, bear the direct, physical, psychological cost of correction, isolation, and abuse. While the men whose decisions set these consequences in motion, Christina's husband delivering her to this facility, rather than reckoning honestly with the end of their marriage, whatever fathers or male authority figures exist in the backgrounds of these other young women's stories, largely escape any equivalent scrutiny or consequence, remaining free to continue their lives unimpeded, while the women they've deemed problems are the ones locked away, subjected to sessions, thrown into isolation. And this asymmetry reflects something true and worth naming about how institutional punishment for perceived sexual or moral transgression has historically fallen disproportionately on women, whose bodies and choices have long been treated as sites requiring external control and correction in a way men's choices rarely are, and Christina's husband facing no institutional consequence whatsoever for his own choice to weaponize legal and familial power against his wife, while Christina herself bears years of confinement and correction, exemplifies exactly this asymmetry, revealing that the facility's actual function is not moral correction applied evenly, but a mechanism specifically calibrated to punish women for stepping outside roles men and the broader patriarchal structure expected them to occupy. Even more troubling and more worth sitting with is the fact that the facility's most direct agents of control, Mother Sarah and Mother Lauren, are themselves women, which initially might seem to complicate this gendered reading, but actually deepens it considerably. Because their positions of institutional power do not represent women's liberation from patriarchal control, they represent instead the specific and painful way women can become instruments of the very systems that constrain them, inheriting an institution built by their parents and perpetuating its logic not necessarily out of personal malice alone, but because they have themselves been shaped by, and perhaps still profit from, exactly the ideological structure that demands women's sexuality remain legible and controllable. And Sarah's confrontation with Lauren over abusing her position reveals this dynamic with particular clarity, because Sarah's concern is not fundamentally about the harm being done to captive young women, it's about internal loyalty and institutional reputation, meaning that even the facility's female leadership operates according to priorities entirely disconnected from the actual well-being of the women in their care. A reminder that women occupying positions of authority within a fundamentally oppressive system does not automatically make that system less oppressive. Sometimes it simply means the machinery of control has found new hands to operate it. This is precisely why the true engine of hope and healing across this entire story comes not from anyone within the facility's official power structure, but from the lateral peer-to-peer relationships between the captive women themselves, Victoria's practical survival wisdom offered to Hayley on her first days, Christina's honest account of her own love story shared with Claire, Jordan's willingness to risk her position to help Hayley escape, Victoria's refusal to leave the facility without her, And this pattern deserves to be named as the story's actual thesis about where real safety and real healing come from for women navigating systems designed to control and diminish them. Not from institutions, not from authority figures, however seemingly sympathetic, but from the horizontal bonds women build with each other. Bonds built on shared vulnerability, mutual honesty, and the simple, radical choice to believe each other over the official narrative being imposed on all of them. And this is worth connecting to something true well beyond the fictional walls of this particular facility, because throughout history, women navigating systems that sought to control their bodies, their choices, and their loves have most often found real refuge, not in the institutions claiming to protect or correct them, but in each other. In networks of mutual aid, shared testimony, and collective resistance that operate beneath and around whatever official structure claims authority over their lives. Hayley's full arc across these 5 scenes, from the initial shock of her mother and girlfriend's betrayal, through her education and survival from Victoria, her horrified witnessing of Claire's abuse, her cautious extension of trust to Jordan despite legitimate anger, and finally, her near-total psychological collapse in the whole followed by her restoration through Victoria's care, traces something genuinely important about what survival under this kind of institutional trauma actually requires. Not a single moment of triumphant defiance, but an ongoing difficult process of nearly losing herself and being pulled back, again and again, by the accumulated evidence of other women's genuine care. And this is worth honoring as a more truthful depiction of trauma survival than any narrative suggesting recovery happens in one clean, decisive act. Because real healing from this kind of harm tends to look exactly like what Hayley experiences. Faltering, nearly succumbing to the abuser's narrative, and being rescued not by her own willpower alone, but by the accumulated network of care other survivors extend to her precisely when she can no longer extend it to herself. What this story ultimately offers, for anyone watching who has experienced anything resembling this kind of institutional or familial rejection for their own sexuality, whether through actual conversion therapy, more subtle forms of family estrangement, or simply the accumulated cultural message that their love requires justification or correction, is a portrait of exactly how survival actually happens, not through the institution ever reforming itself, not through the people who cause the harm suddenly recognizing their error, but through the stubborn, resilient network of solidarity that forms between the people being harmed, each one extending to another exactly the belief, care, and recognition that the system is working so hard to deny them. And if there is a genuine forgiveness at the center of this story, it belongs not to the young women who were told they needed correcting, but to the possibility that they might eventually forgive themselves for ever believing, even briefly, that the facility's cruel verdict about their own hearts could have been true.